In 1915, in the remote hills of the Missouri Ozarks, a story began that would challenge everything the scientific community believed about human intelligence. This is the macabre tale of Clara Caldwell, a young girl whose extraordinary abilities defied explanation, and whose very existence would become a source of both wonder and terror for those who encountered her. The small town of Willow Creek, nestled deep in the Ozark Mountains, had seen its share of strange occurrences over the years, but nothing could have prepared its residents for what they would witness in the coming months. Clara was only 12 years old when the first signs of her unusual gifts began to manifest, and even then the adults around her could hardly believe what they were seeing. The hook is stark, a child who could solve complex mathematical equations faster than a room full of university professors, who could predict weather patterns with uncanny accuracy, and who seemed to possess an almost supernatural understanding of the natural world around her. Before we serve the first course of this story, we must understand the context of the times. In 1915, the American frontier was still largely untamed, and the Ozark region remained isolated from much of the modern world. The people of Willow Creek lived simple lives, dependent on farming, hunting, and the occasional trade with neighboring settlements. Education was basic, often provided by a single teacher in a one-room schoolhouse, and higher learning was a luxury few could afford or access. Clara's parents, Thomas and Margaret Caldwell, were simple folk who had moved to the Ozarks, seeking a quiet life away from the industrial cities of the East. Thomas worked as a blacksmith, while Margaret tended their small farm and raised their 3 children. Clara was the middle child, with an older brother named James and a younger sister named Sarah. From an early age, Clara had shown signs of exceptional intelligence, but her parents attributed this to natural curiosity and a good memory. She could read before most children her age could speak in full sentences, and she had an insatiable appetite for knowledge. She would spend hours in the local library, devouring books on subjects that were far beyond her years. But in the spring of 1915, something changed. Clara began to demonstrate abilities that went far beyond mere intelligence. She could calculate complex arithmetic in her head faster than anyone using a slide rule. She could identify the chemical composition of various substances by their appearance alone, and she seemed to have an intuitive understanding of scientific principles that were only just being discovered by the greatest minds of the era. The townspeople of Willow Creek were initially amazed by Clara's gifts, but as her abilities became more pronounced, a sense of unease began to spread. Some whispered that she was touched by God, while others feared she was something far more sinister. The local minister, Reverend Patterson, declared that Clara's abilities were a sign of the times, perhaps a harbinger of great changes to come. If stories like this grip you, please like the video and subscribe so you don't miss what the records reveal next. The spring of 1915 brought with it a series of events that would forever change the lives of everyone in Willow Creek. Clara's abilities, which had been slowly emerging over the previous months, suddenly intensified in ways that defied all rational explanation. It began with a simple demonstration that would later be remembered as the moment when the townspeople first realized they were dealing with something beyond their understanding. The local school teacher, Miss Eleanor Hartwell, had been conducting a standard arithmetic lesson when Clara raised her hand to correct a calculation that Miss Hartwell had worked out on the blackboard. What made the incident remarkable was not simply that Clara had found an error, but that she had done so instantly, without any visible calculation, and had provided the correct answer to a problem that involved complex multiplication and division. Miss Hartwell, initially skeptical, decided to test Clara further. She presented her with increasingly difficult mathematical problems, each one requiring multiple steps and careful consideration. Clara solved each one with the same effortless precision, her answers coming so quickly that the other students could barely follow the problems themselves. Word of this extraordinary display spread quickly through the small community, and within days parents were bringing their children to observe Clara's abilities firsthand. The local doctor, Dr. Samuel Morrison, was among the first to recognize the potential significance of what they were witnessing. Dr. Morrison had received his medical training at Johns Hopkins University and was well versed in the latest scientific theories of the day. He had never encountered anything like Clara's abilities in his extensive reading or practice. Dr. Morrison began conducting his own informal tests of Clara's capabilities. He presented her with problems in physics, chemistry, and biology, subjects that she had never formally studied, yet she seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of these disciplines that was nothing short of miraculous. When Dr. Morrison showed her a sample of an unknown chemical compound, Clara not only identified its components, but also described its properties and potential uses. When he presented her with diagrams of complex mechanical devices, she could explain their functions and suggest improvements. The most startling demonstration came when Dr. Morrison brought Clara to his medical office and showed her a patient's symptoms that he had been struggling to diagnose. Within minutes, Clara had correctly identified the condition and suggested a treatment that proved to be exactly what the patient needed. As news of these events spread beyond Willow Creek, it attracted the attention of individuals from much farther away. The first to arrive was Professor James Whitmore from the University of Missouri, a specialist in child psychology who had heard rumors of Clara's abilities through academic channels. Professor Whitmore was a man of science, trained to approach extraordinary claims with skepticism and methodical investigation. He brought with him a collection of standardized tests designed to measure various aspects of intelligence and cognitive ability. The results of Professor Whitmore's testing were so remarkable that he immediately sent word to his colleagues at other universities. Clara's scores were off the charts, far exceeding those of any child previously tested, and in many cases surpassing the capabilities of adults with advanced degrees. The professor's report, which was later published in the Journal of Child Psychology, described Clara as possessing cognitive abilities that appear to transcend the normal range of human intelligence. But even as Clara's gifts were being documented and verified by respected academics, a darker current was beginning to flow through the community. Some of the older residents, those who remembered the old ways and held to traditional beliefs, began to speak of Clara in hushed, fearful tones. They saw her abilities not as a gift from God, but as something more sinister, perhaps a manifestation of forces that were better left undisturbed. The truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined, and the real story of Clara Caldwell was only just beginning to unfold. As the summer of 1915 progressed, the situation in Willow Creek became increasingly complex and unsettling. The arrival of Professor Whitmore had been followed by other academics and researchers, each seeking to understand or document Clara's extraordinary abilities. The small town, which had previously known only the quiet rhythms of rural life, now found itself at the center of attention from across the country. The press had begun to take notice as well, and reporters from major newspapers in St. Louis and Kansas City arrived to write stories about the genius girl of the Ozarks. Clara's home became something of a pilgrimage site, with visitors coming from as far away as New York and Chicago to witness her abilities firsthand. The local hotel, which had been nearly empty for months, was now filled to capacity with scientists, journalists, and curious onlookers. But behind the scenes, a more troubling narrative was unfolding. Clara herself seemed to be changing as her abilities continued to manifest in new and unexpected ways. She had begun to experience what she described as visions or flashes of information that came to her unbidden. These episodes were often accompanied by severe headaches and periods of disorientation that left her exhausted for hours afterward. Dr. Morrison, who had become something of a guardian figure for Clara during this period, began to notice that her abilities were taking a physical toll on her young body. Her appetite decreased, her sleep became fitful, and there were times when she seemed to withdraw into herself, lost in thoughts that she couldn't or wouldn't share with others. The other children in the town, who had initially been fascinated by Clara's gifts, began to avoid her. They spoke of feeling uncomfortable in her presence, as if she could somehow see into their minds or know their deepest secrets. Some claimed that Clara would sometimes address them by name and speak of events from their lives that she couldn't possibly have known about. These incidents, whether explained by her remarkable intuition or something more mysterious, created an atmosphere of unease that extended beyond the children to their parents. The adults in town found themselves in a difficult position. On one hand, they were proud of the attention that Clara's abilities brought to their small community. The increased business from visitors had provided a much-needed economic boost, and there was a certain prestige in being associated with such a remarkable individual. On the other hand, there was a growing sense that they were dealing with forces beyond their control or understanding. Reverend Patterson, the local minister, began to hold special prayer meetings for the community, urging them to seek divine guidance in how to handle this unprecedented situation. His sermons took on an increasingly urgent tone, as he spoke of the dangers of pride and vanity in the face of extraordinary gifts. He warned that such abilities, if not properly guided by faith and moral principles, could lead to spiritual corruption or worse. The scientific community's interest in Clara had also attracted the attention of less reputable individuals. Several so-called psychic researchers arrived in town, claiming to represent various organizations dedicated to studying paranormal phenomena. These individuals were often more interested in exploiting Clara's abilities for profit or notoriety than in genuine scientific inquiry. Dr. Morrison found himself having to screen visitors and limit access to Clara as he became concerned about the effect that constant testing and observation was having on her physical and mental health. It was during this period that the first truly disturbing incident occurred. One evening, as Clara sat alone in her family's kitchen, she suddenly began to speak in a voice that was not her own. The words that emerged were in a language that no one present could identify, and her manner of speaking was completely different from her normal behavior. The episode lasted only a few minutes, but it left everyone present deeply shaken. When Clara returned to normal consciousness, she had no memory of what had occurred during the episode. Dr. Morrison, who was called to the scene, was unable to explain what had happened. He had never encountered anything like it in his medical training or experience, and the incident marked a turning point in his understanding of Clara's condition. If this careful middle chapter is earning your trust, please tap like and subscribe, small actions that let us keep telling long stories the patient way. The disturbing incident in Clara's kitchen marked the beginning of a new and more frightening phase in her story. What had initially been perceived as a remarkable gift was now revealing itself to be something far more complex and potentially dangerous. The episode of speaking in an unknown language had been witnessed by her parents and younger sister, and word of it spread through the community with the same rapidity as all the other events surrounding Clara. But this incident was different in kind from the others. Where her mathematical abilities and scientific insights had been seen as positive and beneficial, this new manifestation inspired fear and uncertainty. Dr. Morrison, who had been Clara's primary advocate and protector, found himself struggling to understand what was happening to the young girl. He had never encountered a case like this in his medical training, and the standard texts on child psychology and neurology provided no framework for understanding Clara's condition. He began to suspect that her extraordinary cognitive abilities might be connected to the more disturbing phenomena she was now experiencing, but he had no way to prove this hypothesis. The academic visitors who had come to study Clara also found themselves at a loss to explain what was occurring. Professor Whitmore, who had returned for a second visit, brought with him additional colleagues from the psychology and neurology departments. They conducted extensive tests and observations, but the results were inconclusive. Clara's behavior during these sessions was erratic, sometimes displaying the brilliant cognitive abilities that had first brought her to their attention, and at other times appearing completely normal or even below average in her responses. The inconsistency of her abilities seemed to correlate with her physical and emotional state. When she was rested and calm, her extraordinary abilities would manifest clearly, but when she was tired, stressed, or upset, she would appear to be a completely ordinary child. More troubling still were the episodes that began to occur with increasing frequency. Clara would enter trance-like states during which she would speak of events from the past, sometimes referring to incidents that had occurred decades before she was born. She would describe historical events with remarkable accuracy, providing details that were later verified through historical records. But she would also speak of things that were deeply personal to the people around her, revealing secrets that she could not have known through normal means. The local newspaper, which had initially treated Clara's story with fascination and wonder, began to take on a more ominous tone. The editor, who had been one of Clara's strongest supporters, wrote an editorial questioning whether the constant attention and testing was having a harmful effect on the young girl. He raised concerns about the ethics of subjecting a child to such intense scrutiny and experimentation, particularly when the effects of these activities on her development were unknown. The academic community was divided on the issue. Some argued that Clara's abilities represented a unique opportunity to study human cognition and consciousness in ways that had never before been possible. They believed that the potential scientific knowledge to be gained justified the continued study of her abilities. Others, however, began to question whether they were dealing with something that fell outside the realm of conventional science. Dr. Morrison found himself caught between these two camps, torn between his scientific curiosity and his growing concern for Clara's welfare. The turning point came when Clara began to exhibit what could only be described as prophetic abilities. She would speak of future events with a degree of accuracy that was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. She predicted a major storm that would cause significant flooding in the region, and her prediction proved accurate down to the specific day and intensity. She foretold of the arrival of a traveling medicine show, providing details about the performers and their acts that matched exactly what occurred when the show arrived a week later. These predictions, while accurate, were deeply unsettling to those who heard them. Clara herself seemed to be disturbed by her ability to see future events. She would often appear frightened after making such predictions, as if the knowledge of what was to come was a burden she was not equipped to bear. The community's attitude toward Clara began to shift once again, from wonder and curiosity to fear and suspicion. Some began to whisper that she was not merely gifted but cursed, and that her abilities were a sign of dark forces at work in their community. The autumn of 1915 brought with it a growing sense of dread that settled over Willow Creek like a heavy fog. Clara's abilities, which had once been a source of wonder and pride for the community, had become something altogether more sinister. The townspeople who had initially celebrated her gifts now found themselves avoiding her, crossing the street when they saw her approaching, and whispering prayers under their breath when she passed. The academic visitors who had come from across the country to study Clara began to leave, some quietly in the night, others making excuses to return to their universities before their planned departure dates. Professor Whitmore, who had been the most persistent in his efforts to understand Clara's condition, was among the last to leave. He departed with a heavy heart and a warning that the community would be dealing with forces beyond their comprehension. The so-called prophetic abilities that Clara had begun to exhibit had become increasingly disturbing. She would speak of deaths that had not yet occurred, describing the circumstances with chilling accuracy. When her predictions proved true, the community could no longer dismiss them as coincidence or lucky guesses. The local undertaker, who had initially been skeptical of Clara's abilities, found himself overwhelmed with business as her predictions came to pass with unerring accuracy. But it was not just death that Clara seemed to foresee. She spoke of accidents, natural disasters, and personal tragedies that would befall the residents of Willow Creek and the surrounding areas. Each prediction was delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone she had once used when solving mathematical equations, but now the words carried a weight of inevitability that was deeply unsettling. Morrison, who had remained as Clara's physician and protector, found himself in an impossible position. His medical training told him that there had to be a rational explanation for what was occurring, but the evidence of his own eyes and ears defied all rational understanding. He began to document everything in meticulous detail, hoping that future analysis might reveal some pattern or explanation that he was currently missing. The documentation became a kind of diary, filled with observations of Clara's behavior, the circumstances surrounding her predictions, and the effects of her abilities on both herself and the community. In these notes, Dr. Morrison recorded his growing concern that Clara was not merely predicting future events, but somehow connected to them in ways that were not yet understood. He noted that her most accurate predictions often occurred during times of emotional stress, or when she was in close proximity to the individuals who would be affected by the predicted events. The relationship between Clara's abilities and the events she predicted seemed to be more complex than simple foresight. Clara herself had become increasingly withdrawn as the autumn progressed. The constant attention, the fear in people's eyes when they looked at her, and the burden of knowledge about future events had taken a severe toll on her mental and emotional well-being. She spent more and more time alone, often found sitting in the woods surrounding Willow Creek, staring into the distance, as if she were watching events unfold that were invisible to everyone else. Her family, who had once been proud of her gifts, now lived in a state of constant anxiety. They worried not only about the effect of her abilities on Clara herself, but about the growing hostility from their neighbors. Some residents had begun to speak openly of the need to deal with the situation that Clara represented. Threatening letters appeared in mailboxes throughout the town, and there were reports of people gathering at night to discuss what they saw as the supernatural threat in their midst. Reverend Patterson, who had initially tried to provide spiritual guidance for the situation, found himself facing pressure from his congregation to take more decisive action. The church that had once been a place of comfort and community had become a site of heated debate, with some parishioners demanding that Clara be exorcised or banished from the community. The winter months were approaching, and with them came the realization that Willow Creek had become a place of fear and division. The story of the genius girl who had once brought fame and attention to the small town was transforming into something far darker and more complex. What nobody knew was that the most disturbing revelations were yet to come, and that Clara's abilities were only beginning to reveal their true nature and purpose. The winter of 1915 proved to be the most harrowing period in the history of Willow Creek. and the climax of Clara Caldwell's disturbing story was about to unfold with terrible clarity. The predictions that had been plaguing the community for months reached a crescendo as Clara began to speak of a catastrophic event that would befall the town itself. She described it in vivid, terrifying detail, a fire that would consume the heart of Willow Creek, claiming the lives of many residents and leaving the community in ruins. Unlike her previous predictions, which had involved individual deaths or accidents, this was a large-scale disaster that would affect everyone in the town. Clara's warnings about the coming fire became more frequent and more urgent as the winter progressed. She would speak of specific buildings that would burn, the time and manner in which the fire would start, and the paths it would take through the town. She named individuals who would perish in the flames, describing their final moments with an accuracy that was impossible to dismiss or ignore. The townspeople were divided in their response to these warnings. Some, driven by fear and desperation, began to make preparations to leave Willow Creek before the predicted disaster could occur. Others, however, had reached the end of their patience with Clara and her disturbing abilities. They had come to believe that she was not merely predicting the future, but somehow causing the events she described. This belief gained momentum as the accuracy of her previous predictions became undeniable, and some residents began to see her as a malevolent force that needed to be eliminated. The tension in the community reached a breaking point on a frigid February night when a group of townspeople, led by Sheriff William Hayes, came to the Caldwell home with the intention of taking Clara into custody. They claimed that she was a danger to the community and that her removal was necessary for the safety of all residents. Dr. Morrison, who had been staying with the Caldwell family to protect Clara from the growing hostility of the townspeople, attempted to intervene. He argued that Clara was a child who needed protection and medical care, not imprisonment. But the crowd was past the point of reason, driven by fear and the desire to stop what they saw as a supernatural threat. What happened next would shock the entire community and confirm their worst fears about Clara's abilities. As the confrontation escalated and the crowd pressed forward to take Clara, she suddenly fell into one of her trance-like states. But this time, instead of speaking of future events, she began to speak of what was happening in that very moment, but from perspectives that were impossible for her to observe. She described the thoughts and intentions of individuals in the crowd, revealed secrets that would have been unknown to anyone else, and most disturbing of all, she began to speak of the fire she had been predicting, but as if it were happening in that very moment. The crowd, which had been unified in their determination to take Clara, suddenly found themselves frozen in place as she revealed intimate details about each person present. She spoke of crimes they had committed in secret, of thoughts they had never shared with anyone, and of events from their past that were known only to themselves. The effect of Clara's words was immediate and devastating. Several individuals in the crowd collapsed from shock and fear, while others fled the scene in terror. The confrontation ended not with Clara's capture, but with the complete disintegration of the group that had come to take her. But the incident marked a turning point in the story that would have far-reaching consequences. That very night, as if triggered by the events at the Caldwell home, the fire that Clara had been predicting began to spread through the heart of Willow Creek. It started in the general store, exactly as she had described, and followed the precise path she had outlined in her warnings. The fire moved with an almost supernatural speed and intensity, consuming building after building, in a pattern that matched Clara's predictions with terrifying accuracy. The death toll was exactly as Clara had foretold, with specific individuals perishing in the flames, just as she had described. The horror that unfolded that night confirmed what many had feared. Clara Caldwell possessed abilities that transcended normal human understanding, and her predictions were not merely forecasts of the future, but somehow connected to the events themselves. Justice would come, but at a terrible price. The aftermath of the Willow Creek fire of February 1915 left the community forever changed, and the story of Clara Caldwell reached its tragic and mysterious conclusion. The fire had devastated the heart of the town, destroying the general store, the post office, the bank, and several residential buildings. 18 people had perished in the flames, exactly as Clara had predicted, and their deaths had been as she had described them in haunting detail. The survivors, many of whom had heeded Clara's warnings and fled the area, returned to find their community in ruins and their faith in the natural order of things shattered. Dr. Morrison, who had been with the Caldwell family during the night of the fire, found himself facing a situation that defied all medical and scientific understanding. When the flames reached the Caldwell home, Clara had been there, but when the ashes were cleared, There was no sign of her or her family. The house had burned completely, like all the others. But while the remains of other victims had been found in the debris, no trace of the Caldwell family was ever discovered. It was as if they had simply vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind only questions and an enduring mystery. The official investigation into the fire concluded that it had been caused by a faulty chimney in the general store, but this explanation satisfied few people who were familiar with Clara's predictions. The accuracy with which she had described the fire's path, the buildings it would consume, and the individuals who would perish seemed to indicate that the event was connected to her abilities in ways that could not be explained by conventional means. Professor Whitmore, who had returned to investigate the aftermath of the events he had witnessed months earlier, found the situation even more perplexing than before. He had come to believe that Clara's abilities represented a phenomenon that existed at the intersection of human consciousness and the fabric of reality itself. Her predictions were not simply forecasts of future events, but seemed to be somehow connected to the actual occurrence of those events. In his final report on the case, which was never published due to the controversial nature of its conclusions, Professor Whitmore wrote that Clara appeared to exist in a state of temporal and spatial flux, able to perceive and potentially influence events across multiple dimensions of reality. The remaining residents of Willow Creek struggled to rebuild their community, but the shadow of Clara's story lingered over everything they did. Some families chose to leave the area entirely, unable to live in a place where such supernatural events had occurred. Others remained but lived with a constant awareness that the normal rules of cause and effect might not apply to their world. The site where the Caldwell home had stood became something of a pilgrimage point for those interested in the paranormal, despite the lack of any physical evidence of what had occurred there. Local folklore began to develop around Clara's story, with some claiming to see her wandering the ruins of the town on foggy nights, still carrying the burden of knowledge about events yet to come. The academic community, meanwhile, was divided over the implications of what had occurred in Willow Creek. Some dismissed the entire incident as a tragic coincidence, while others believed that Clara had demonstrated abilities that challenged the fundamental assumptions of human consciousness and reality. Dr. Morrison, who had maintained detailed records of Clara's abilities and behavior throughout the months he had known her, found himself unable to continue his medical practice. The experience had shaken his faith in the scientific method and left him questioning everything he had believed about the nature of human understanding. He eventually left the practice of medicine entirely and spent the remainder of his life studying accounts of similar phenomena, searching for patterns that might explain what had happened to Clara Caldwell. The story of the genius girl who had confounded science and terrified a community became a cautionary tale about the dangers of abilities that exceed human comprehension. It served as a reminder that some mysteries are perhaps better left unsolved, and that the pursuit of knowledge can sometimes lead to places where the human mind is not equipped to follow. In the end, Clara Caldwell remained an enigma, a young girl whose extraordinary gifts had made her both a wonder and a terror to those who knew her. Her legacy was not one of scientific advancement or human achievement, but of the profound mystery that surrounds the limits of human consciousness and the nature of reality itself. The Ozark town of Willow Creek was eventually rebuilt, but it never fully recovered from the events of that winter, and the name Clara Caldwell became synonymous with abilities that science could not explain, and phenomena that challenged the very foundations of rational understanding. This is the legacy of fear that her story left behind, a reminder that some human experiences transcend the boundaries of conventional knowledge and remain forever beyond the reach of scientific explanation. The first scientists to arrive in Willow Creek did not bring miracles, they brought notebooks. Professor Alton Reeves from the State Normal School came with a barometer, a deck of weather cards, and a habit of asking the same question 3 ways. He sat with Clara at a kitchen table that had seen far more bread than theories, and laid out problems on paper as if they were seeds: calculate the angle of the sun at noon from the length of a fence post shadow, predict the temperature at dawn from the night's wind, estimate the time until rain from the shape of clouds without looking out the window. Clara answered, then explained her answers aloud, a gift rarer than quickness. Reeves tried to catch her on the edge cases. He swapped numbers mid-problem to see if she was following form or sense. She followed sense. He changed the local variables. Suppose the creek runs faster, and she affectionately corrected him. The creek does not speed up, the slope does. When he asked how she knew, she put her hand on the sill and said, because the sill dries first at the top. It was observation turned into law in a child's voice, a calculus rooted in chores. Meanwhile, Reverend Patterson watched with a pastoral worry he struggled to name. The town had room for a bright girl. It had fewer rooms for a prodigy who attracted strangers. He preached gently about gifts and humility, about the difference between wonder and spectacle. His sermon notes, preserved in a brittle ledger, contain a pencil question in the margin: how to keep wolves without building walls. The wolves were not metaphors. A traveling promoter had already appeared at the general store with a pamphlet template in his pocket. Come witness the girl who measures the wind. Clara's mother learned to answer the door with a rag in her hand so she could pretend to be too busy to entertain visitors. Her father, practical and quiet, built a shelf high on the wall where Clara could keep the notebooks Reeves gave her, out of the reach of curious fingers and careless siblings. The schoolmistress, Mrs. Allen, altered her lessons not to separate Clara from the class but to let the class see what Clara saw, measuring the schoolyard with twine and steps, timing the echo from the barn wall, drawing the arc of the sun across the blackboard as if they were all farmers planting a field. The question underneath every adult conversation was steady and unspectacular: how do we raise a brilliant child without breaking her? In 1915, there was no official answer. There were only households adjusting dials, more books, fewer visitors, more chores, fewer errands alone, more time with Mrs. Allen, fewer demonstrations for men who wrote to newspapers. Reeves wrote to a colleague that he had found a mind with no wasted motion. He also wrote that the town had a narrow bridge to walk between pride and protection. Letters followed Reeves back to the city like burrs on a coat. Some were generous. Teachers asking how to encourage patience when a child's questions outran the textbook. Some were not. Men who wanted measurements turned into wagers. Editors sniffing for a story they could sell between advertisements for patent tonics. Reeves answered a few and ignored the rest. He returned to Willow Creek with 2 colleagues who understood both math and manners. They brought a small kymograph, slips of smoked paper, and an agreement with Clara's parents. Nothing public, nothing paid, and every afternoon ended at a decent hour with a walk home in daylight. What they learned complicates the legend and makes it truer. Clara was fast, yes, but speed was not the remarkable thing. Accuracy was. Give her odd data, wind from 2 directions in an hour, and she would ask about the shape of the holler and the way heat pools near the river. Then she would correct for it like a surveyor with a better instrument. Ask her to predict rain, and she would list variables you could not see from a window: the feel of splinters in the porch rail when the air grew heavy, the way the dog lay on his side instead of his belly, the flat ring a pail made when set on the wellstone. She was not conjuring. She was counting, with senses tuned by a life that required attention to small changes. The men debated quietly about nature and training. Was Clara born this way, or had the Ozarks sharpened a talent any child could grow if properly invited? The answer, so unsatisfying to pamphleteers, was both. Reeves noted that when he asked abstract questions with no foothold in dirt or timber, Clara grew impatient. When he tied number to need, she leapt. "We keep mistaking practicality for lack of imagination," he wrote, a sentence that would have saved many girls years of boredom if anyone had copied it into a training manual. The town, for its part, learned the choreography of care. Mrs. Allen set a small desk near her own, not to isolate Clara, but to give her a place to work when the room grew loud. The Caldwell's neighbor, Mrs. Whitcomb, took it upon herself to intercept salesmen at the road with lemonade and a firm no. Reverend Patterson visited on Sundays and spoke about callings as something lived, not performed. It was ordinary decency arrayed against a world that wanted to turn a child into a headline. Years later, there would be arguments in alumni magazines about whether Clara should have been sent away to a city school. The people who loved her had heard all the offers and declined the ones that treated her like a curiosity. When she did leave, it was at 19, with a small savings collected in quiet gifts, bound not for a stage but for a college where Reeves had found a professor who wrote, "Send me a student who loves questions more than applause." The letter is in an archive now, its ink browned, its gentleness still legible. If patient, source-grounded work like this resonates with you, like and subscribe. It keeps us in the archives and out of the circus.